Japheth shall enlargeth and dwell in the tents of Shem. But before we get too deep into the video, first I want to tell you guys about my social media platforms. So I have a Clubhouse account and we can actually talk to one another on it. I also host Clubhouse rooms every now and then where I might talk about history and genetics of the Middle East and Africa. I have a Twitter page, a Facebook account, and a Facebook page, as well as a Instagram, all titled The Hebrew of Israel. And what I typically do on these platforms is post upcoming videos as well as slides for my presentations. And so just be on the lookout for all of that on my social media platforms. And if you want to support me financially for the channel, you can look at my Patreon as well as my PayPal and my GoFundMe. And with all of that out of the way, let's begin with the video. First, let's quickly establish who is haplogroup E and J biblically. So who is haplogroup E? E-M34 is the main Middle Eastern variety of E1B1B and is thought to have arrived with the Proto-Semitic people in the late Copper to early Bronze Age. That's from EUpedia, titled Haplogroup E1B1B. So here's a chart showing the genealogy of Semitic languages. Proto-Semitic has various branches within it. And from Proto-Semitic, you'll get West Semitic, Central Semitic, Southwest Semitic, Canaanite, and Paleo-Hebrew and Hebrew. So Hebrew is a Semitic language. It comes from Proto-Semitic. The Israelites were a confederation of Iron Age Semitic-speaking tribes of the ancient Near East. Hebrew people are mostly taken as synonymous with the Semitic-speaking Israelites. So Hebrews and Israelites are one and the same. But to be more technical, all Hebrews are not Israelites, but Israelites are Hebrews. And here is a chart showing the genealogy. You have Shem, and then you get Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Ru, Serg, Nahor, Terah, then Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then you see a basic map just illustrating where Semitic speakers are, Semitic people. And here is an overlay of Semitic and Natufian. And you see that, interestingly enough, Natufian spreads outward into regions where you find Semitic people. I do believe there is a very strong connection between Natufian genetic component and Semitic people. This is from In Hot Pursuit of Language and Prehistory, and it reads, this paper makes an additional inference, since there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant. So I want to make that clear that it's not just me saying that Natufians are the ancestors of Semites. This is coming from PhD scholars within the field of anthropology. And such a scenario would also explain the presence of Y chromosome haplogroup E in the Natufians and Levantine farmers, a common link between the Levant and Africa. So when it comes to their Y DNA, Natufians and Levantine farmers had haplogroup E. This is from Paleolithic DNA from the Caucasus-revealed core of West Eurasian ancestry. So if the ancestors of ancestors of Semites are Natufians and Levantine farmers, and if the Natufians have haplogroup E, then it logically makes sense to say that the Semites as well will have haplogroup E. These are their ancestors. And so here is just a basic map illustrating people with Levant Natufian close genetic distance. And you can see from the right hand of your screen over here, right side of the screen, that or the left side of the screen, excuse me, that This is the distance of Levant Natufian when it comes to modern populations, and to the right-hand side of your screen is peoples with haplogroup E, and you typically see a very close association with haplogroup E and Natufian ancestry. This is dealing with Yemenite people with Natufian ancestry. They also have 25 to 50% of haplogroup E. And when it comes to peoples such as Berbers and Libyans and Bedouins and Tunisians, etc., and Moroccans, you see high amounts. You see that they represent another close population to Natufians, and they too have high amounts of haplogroup E. As you can see, Moroccan Arabs, as an example, can have up to 75%. Berbers can have up to 60 to 89%. Tunisians, Algerians have up to 55 to 65%. So these peoples have high amounts of Natufian ancestry. And again, just showing you another map when it comes to Natufian ancestry. You see right here with Moroccan Arabs and Berbers having up to 70 to 80% of haplogroup E. And then when it comes to Palestinians, Jordanians, and Samaritans, they also are another people with genetic distance being very close to Levant Natufians. So the Samaritans, as an example, the priestly Kohan lineage from the tribe of Levi. However, the biggest and most important Samaritan family, the Kohan family, tradition tribe of Levi, was found to belong to haplogroup E. This article predated the change of the classification of haplogroup E3b1-M78 to E3b1A-M78, and the further subdivision of E3b1A-M78 into 6 subclades based on the research of chronicry. And so Samaritans have haplogroup E, and Samaritan Levites specifically, they have up to like 100% of haplogroup E. Arabs in Egypt have up to 62% of haplogroup E. Arab Palestinians have 31%, as well as Arabs in the Jordan have 31%. So these are populations of people with haplogroup E, and these peoples have very close connections to the Natufians. And then lastly is more North African populations: Tunisians, Moroccans, Algerians, Sahrawi. So you see, again, just re-showing you more maps of these peoples. They have high amounts of E, going up to 98% when it comes to Berbers and Moroccan Arabs. When it comes to E-M81, but there's also E-M78, where high amounts of haplogroup E is found as well. And then, these peoples have very small amounts of haplogroup J. I want to make that clear. North Africa, there's a very small percentage of J. But anyways, when it comes to the Bayesian phylogenetic analysis of Semitic languages, identifies an early Bronze Age origin of Semitic in the Near East. Basically, we were able to discover that, there is a Levant origin of Semitic peoples. It says, we used Bayesian phylogenetic methods to elucidate the relationships and divergent dates of Semitic languages, which we then related to epiographic and archaeological records to produce a comprehensive hypothesis of Semitic languages and dispersals after the divergence of ancestral Semitic from Afroasiatic in Africa. We estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. So you see that, as they said, Semitic originated in the Levant, and then they spread into Mesopotamia with groups like the Akkadians. And this fits genetically what we see. The most plausible candidates for Semitic remigration to the Fertile Crescent with TM-RCAs fitting the arrival of the Akkadians and other early Semitic peoples are certain subclades of both E-V22 and E-V12 with relatively early TM-RCAs present in the Middle East could be candidates for such remigration, such as E-FGC14308 TMRCA 2200 BCE, and E-M 3262 TMRCA's 2600 BCE. And that's from the paper How Eurasia Was Born. And so here's just maps illustrating the migration of E, and you do see old clades of E in the Levant. And then as you expand away from the Levant, you begin to see younger clades of E. So here's the high concentration of E markers we find, and then the more you go out into Mesopotamia, the E clades get younger, which sort of indicates that Semitic migration from the Levant into Mesopotamia and other parts of the Middle East as well. So I would say Shem is haplogroup E based on its association with Proto-Semitic populations. The genetic background of Shem would be Natufian, Neolithic Levantines, and other related populations. So here's just a map showing everything. Here's all the peoples with Natufian related DNA, and then here's a map, and it kind of does fit, as you can see, with most Natufian DNA being highest concentrated in the Middle East and then expanding into Africa and other parts of the Middle East. And here's a map of Semitic languages, Semitic people, and then here is a map of haplogroup E and Natufian ancestry, and as you can see, haplogroup E and Natufian ancestry fits perfectly, fits beautifully, actually. So, biblically, who is haplogroup J? Haplogroup IJ is a human Y chromosome DNA haplogroup, an intermediate descendant of haplogroup IJK, formerly known as haplogroup F-L15. The intermediate descendants of IJ are haplogroup I and haplogroup J. Its sole sibling is K, which includes most of the world's male population. That right there to me kind of indicates why haplogroup J couldn't really be Semitic, because if we say haplogroup J is Semitic, then we have to say haplogroup I is Semitic, and that K is also Semitic, its sole sibling, and then we'll basically have to say that most of the world's male population is Semitic, is from Shem. That really wouldn't make too much sense. I, J, K, it's all related. They're all siblings, and then from K will come most males. So kind of wouldn't makes too much sense to say most of the world's population is Shem. So now let's deal with haplogroup I. Haplogroup I1 is the most common type of haplogroup I in Northern Europe. It is found mostly in Scandinavia and Finland, where it typically represents over 35% of the Y chromosomes associated with the Norse ethnicity. I1 is found in all places invaded by ancient Germanic tribes and the Vikings. After the core of ancient Germanic civilization in Scandinavia, the highest frequency of I1 are observed in other Germanic-speaking regions such as Germany, Austria, the Low Countries, England, and the Scottish Islands, which all have between 10 and 20% of I1 lineages. This is from Eupedia, haplogroup I1. So this is from Encyclopedia Judaica, dealing with Ashkenaz, and it reads, in the Babylonian Talmud, Yom 10a, the biblical Gomer, the father of Ashkenaz, is rendered as Germania, although in its original context the reference is to Germanica in northwest Syria. In addition to this incorrect identification, a possible source of explanation may be in the name Skanza or Scania, the designation of Scandinavia in several sources, which was regarded as the cradle of some Germanic tribes. The association of Ashkenaz and Scandinavia or Scandina is found as early as the 6th century in the Latin Endymion to the chronology of Eusebius. And this continuing from Eupedia, haplogroup I1, it says, the Germanic migrations dispersed I1 lineages to Britain, Anglo-Saxons, Bulgarian, Franks, Saxons, France, Franks, Visigoths, South Germany, Franks, and others, Switzerland, Iberia, Visigoths, Vandals, Italy, Goths, Vandals, Lombards, Austria, and Ostrogoths, Lombards, Ukraine, and Goths, as well as around Hungary and northern Serbia. The Danish and Norwegian Vikings brought more I1 to Britain, Ireland, and Isles of Man, Normandy, Flanders, Iberia, Sicily. The Swedish Vikings, Varangians, set up colonies in Russia and Ukraine and outposts as far as the Byzantine Empire and the Caucasus and Persia. The higher frequency of I1 in northwest Russia, east of the Baltic, hints at had a particular strong Varangian presence, which is correlated with the establishment of the Ket van Rus by the Swedes. So this is from the tug of war between genetics and archaeology, and it reads, interestingly, the medieval Jewish name for Germany is Ashkenaz. But what makes the connection even more telling is that it appears that Ashkenaz's grandson, Ingwin, or great-grandson, Istengwin, settled in northern Germany and then spread out from there to Denmark and the Netherlands. From there, no later than the 8th generation from Ashkenaz, they had colonized Sweden and conquered England. The timeline for this is somewhere between 1900 through 1652 BC, according to historian James Anderson, which fits right in the end of the Ice Age and early post-Ice Age in northern Europe. And so here is where Ashkenaz, his descendants coming from the Middle East, going into modern day what we call Germany, as well as modern day Switzerland, Sweden, the British Isles, and the Germanic peoples would be such as the Goths, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, Anglo-Saxons, Norse, Icelandic people, and various other groups. And so now I think y'all starting to see the picture when it comes to what I am displaying. Now you see a very strong association with Ashkenaz and haplogroup I1, or just haplogroup I in general. Ashkenaz and haplogroup I seem to fit perfectly. These peoples being very closely related, these peoples having very similar history, migration patterns, and even it seems like according to their oral history that they claim descent from Ashkenaz. And the Jews seem to have connected them to Ashkenaz as well, connected the Germanic people to Ashkenaz, to be specific. So looking at haplogroup IJ, you could associate Ashkenaz to haplogroup I. According to scriptures, Ashkenaz had a brother named Togarmah. Togarmah's descendants could be associated with haplogroup J. Genesis chapter 10, verse 2 through 5 reads, the sons of Japheth were Gomer, and we're going to skip down to Gomer. The sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz, Rephath, and Togarmah. So let's look at Togarmah. Upper Paleolithic genomes reveal deep roots of modern Eurasians, and it reads, both Georgian hunter-gatherer samples were assigned to haplogroup J, with Katos belonging to the subhaplogroup J2A. In a study exploring J haplogroups in 445 individuals from Eurasia, J2A was found at highest frequency in Georgia and Iraq. It is intriguing that both the mitochondrial and Y chromosome haplogroups of our ancient Georgian samples have been associated with the Neolithization of Europe. This tentatively suggests a genetic link between Georgian hunter-gatherers and early European migrants from the Near East. So we do see a connection with haplogroup J among ancient Georgians and even modern Georgians, but also we see a connection between Caucasus hunter-gatherers or Georgian hunter-gatherers with Europe. So it's very interesting. Here's where we found those samples, by the way, in Georgia, western Georgia. And dealing with haplogroup J in ancient times, when we get more closer to human populations that we can record better. It reads, the Northwest Caucasian language family seems to show clear links to ancient Eastern Anatolia, as most subclades of J1-Z1842 can be linked to the Armenian highlands in present-day Azerbaijan, precisely fitting the exact location of the core Araxes culture. Three subclades of it, J1-ZS3042, J1-ZS5658, J1-ZS2872, and J1-Y5353, are widespread among Northeast Caucasian groups, suggest Northeast Caucasian languages to have originated from the core Araxes culture, as ancient J1 subclades also seem to have been present in the ancient Levant as well. This supports the existence of the Alduin language family, linking Hurrian to Northeast Caucasian. So we see a link between Caucasian languages and haplogroup J, specifically Northeast Caucasian, specifically Cora Araxes and Hurrian. So this is from EUpedia, Middle East Regional DNA Project, and it reads, the Caucasus was the birthplace of bronze metallurgy, and the two great Bronze Age cultures that stem from it, the Mayakope Yamnaya and Core Araxes cultures, expanded far and wide and reshaped the genetic landscape of Western Eurasia. South Caucasians would have belonged to Y haplogroups J1 and J2, later associated with the core Araxes culture. So we see a connection between the core Araxes culture and South Caucasians with haplogroups J1 and J2. And so this is from Hurru-Uratrian from the lexico-statistical viewpoint, and it reads, the Hurru-Uratrian linguistic family consists of two closely related languages, Hurrian with several dialects and Uratrian. Despite the chronological distance between the attested Hurrian and Uratrian, it seems clear that the latter is not a direct descendant of the former, but the two languages represent two separate branches of a common proto-language, Proto-Hurru-Uratrian. For the pre-literate period, it is natural to associate the Hurru-Uratrian people with the core Araxes early Transcaucasian archaeological culture. In this period immediately prior to the emergence of the Hurrians, the northern area of their distribution was occupied by the core Araxes culture, circa 3400 through 2500 BC. The distribution of core Araxes sites would encompass the territory of the Ito and Uratrians, as well as the northern part of the Hurrians. It is often presumed that the core Araxes culture is an archaeological reflection of the Hurrians, and that's from Encyclopedia of Indo-European Culture. So we see a connection with core Araxes, with Hurrians, Hurru-Uratrians, and Uratrians. Basically, these are Caucasian peoples, non-Semitic peoples. It says right here, the Hurrian language was neither Semitic nor Indo-European. I'm going to repeat that again. The Hurrian language was neither Semitic nor Indo-European, and it's these Hurrians who seem to have to be an ancient population with more or so the original stock of haplogroup J. That's from narrative literature of Hurrian origin, moving treasures from the ancient Near East. In this book, The History of Ancient Palestine, and it reads, among the invaders of Syria during the 2nd millennium BCE were the Hurrians, a non-Semitic people. Repeat that again, the Hurrians, a non-Semitic people which, as time went by, created one of the most powerful states in the Near East, namely the Mitanni Kingdom. So again, these Hurrians were a non-Semitic people who founded kingdoms, powerful kingdoms in the Near East. And it's believed that these Hurrians, likely, they carried haplogroup J markers. And I'm just going to read this, dealing with the Hurrians and modern populations that could be connected to them. This is from Ancient Anatolian, the Oxford Handbook, and it reads, the Hurrian as a whole shared a yet earlier common ancestor with some of the numerous and comparatively obscure languages of the Caucasus is not improbable. Modern Caucasian languages are conventionally divided into southern, northwestern, and northeastern families. Georgian, for example, belonged to the southern family. Dankov and Starshnim in the north, in the most thorough attempt at finding a linkage yet published, have argued that Hurrian is a branch of the Eastern Caucasian family. This would make it a distinct relative of such modern languages as Chechenian, Avar, Lak, and Uyid. So what's interesting is that when it comes to these modern populations, it would seem that in its purest sense, the descendants of the Hurrians in their purest sense would be these Northeast Caucasian peoples like Chechenians and English. Although Hurrians were in the Middle East and they did leave descendants there, the most purest form of a Hurrian would probably be these Northeast Caucasians. Of the peoples existing in our time, the Chechenians and English are the closest to the Hurrian in terms of language. So it says right there, they will be the closest in our modern times. So this is from Parallel Evolution of Genes and Languages in the Caucasus region, and it reads, again, haplogroup J2A4B*M67 comprise 51 through 79% of the Y chromosomes in the English and 3 Chechenian populations, Northeast Caucasus NAC linguistic group. Finally, haplogroup J1*M267 comprise 44 through 99% of the Avar, Dargins, and I'm just going to name some of them, Leluzgians, Southeast Caucasus Dagestan linguistic group. So basically, NAC Dagestan people have the highest forms of haplogroup J that we see in the Caucasus, and these are Northeast Caucasian populations. Again, interestingly enough, these Caucasian populations being linked to the Hurrians, being, as I said, perhaps the purest form that we will find of a Hurrian in the Caucasus. And so when it comes to their genealogy, from a biblical standpoint, these Chechenian, English, Northeast Caucasian peoples claim descent from Torgorma. Caucasus, or Kavoskas, was the supposed ancestor of Chechenians and English according to Georgian chronologies or chronicles. And so this is why I'm saying haplogroup J seems to have more of a connection with Torgorma, and this would make sense with haplogroup J's brother, haplogroup I, being associated with Ashkenaz. I'm just going to read another source dealing with the connection between Caucasians and Torgorma. This is from the Venek, the Chechen and English. This deals with their genealogy, and it reads, the Veneks, as it is already known to the reader, are the ancient natives of the Caucasus. It is noteworthy that according to the genealogical table drawn up by Leonti Meveroni, the legendary forefather of the Veneks was Kavoskas, hence the name Kavoskians, or Caucasians. Anyways, one of the ethnicons met in the ancient Georgian written sources, signifying the ancestors of the Chechenians and English. As appears from the above, the Veneks, at least by name, are presented as the most Caucasian people of the Caucasus, or should I say, the most Caucasian people of all the Caucasians. Caucasus, Kavuskians in the Georgian historical tradition. So I'm going to pause right there. Chechens and English people, these Vanik peoples, these are the most Caucasian people of all Caucasians in the Caucasus. And they have this connection with a man named Kavuskis. That's who they're claiming as their ancestor. So it reads, according to the version of Litoni Meveronis Kavuskis and his brother Lek, migrated from Transcaucasia to the uninhabited northern Caucasus and occupied the territory from the mountains to the mouth of the Volga. According to archaeological data, in the Bronze Age, the ancient Caucasian tribes inhabited not only the mountains of the North Caucasus, but also the lowlands going far into the steppe. So it seems like archaeology kind of backs up this story, this ancient narrative that they have. And so again, just showing you peoples with some of the highest amounts of haplogroup J in the Caucasus, and we see that these Nak Dangestani populations that I have highlighted in green, they have up to 87 to 99% of haplogroup J, both J1 and J2. So this really seems to be who J is mostly associated with in ancient times. It's really more Caucasian than it is anything else. So haplogroup J is likely associated with Japheth. Chechens and English have a tradition of descending from Togarma. Chechens and English have the highest haplogroup J, or Nak Dangestani people. Chechens and English also descend from a branch of non-Semitic Hurrians, and Hurrians also likely had haplogroup J. You find haplogroup J among ancient non-Semitic Caucasian populations as well. So, as we can see down below, or I just start at the top, as you can see up here, Togarma going into the Caucasus and other parts of Eurasia, and then you see associated with haplogroup J, and then you see over here with haplogroup I, Ashkenaz going into Germany, Switzerland, Scandinavia, the British Isles becoming the Germanic peoples. There's a perfect overlap between Ashkenaz and haplogroup I, and Togarma and haplogroup J, and then phenotypically, these peoples will have more Armenoid phenotype. I guess you can consider them to be slightly pigmented, Middle Easterners, whereas Ashkenaz would have more of a Germanic, Nordic phenotype, and these would be more of the depigmented, Middle Eastern types, in a sense. So now another people believed to descend from Togarma are the Armenians, who are another Caucasian population, but by understanding the Armenians and their genetic background and who is related to them in modern times, this can help us understand who is who in the Middle East, who descends from Japheth and who descends from Shem. So let's look at the Armenian genome, because this is going to help us figure it out. So the Hurrians. The Hurrians were a people of the Bronze Age Near East who spoke a Hurrian language called Hurrian and lived in Anatolia, Syria, and northern Mesopotamia. The largest and most influential Hurrian nation was the Kingdom of Mitanni, its ruling class perhaps being Indo-Iranian speakers. The people of the Indo-European speaking Hittite Empire in Anatolia included a large population of Hurrians, and there is significant Hurrian influence in Hittite mythology. By the early Iron Age, the Hurrians had been assimilated with other peoples. Their remnants were subdued by a related people that formed the state of Urartu, and present-day Armenians are an amalgam of the Indo-European groups with the Hurrians and Urartians. Now I'm going to read that last part again because it's very important. The present-day Armenians are an amalgam of the Indo-European groups with the Hurrians and Urartians. Again, present-day Armenians are an amalgam of Indo-European groups with the Hurrians and Urartians. So basically, Armenians are a mixture of Indo-Europeans and Hurrians. So looking at the Armenian genome and seeing who else is related to these Armenians can kind of give us a good insight of ethnically who is who in the Middle East. Because again, the Armenians have a tradition of descending from Togarmah, and we're going to see genetically who is related to Armenians, who else could descend from Togarmah, basically. Who else could descend from Japheth in the Middle East. So I'm just going to read you one more source that deals with Armenians being mixed of these peoples. Encyclopedia of Indo-European Culture. The Armenians, according to Dankov, are then an amalgam of the Hurrians and Eretrians, Luvians, and the Proto-Armenian Mushki, who carried their Indo-European language eastwards across Anatolia. And dealing with the Armenian mythology, this is from Ancient History Encyclopedia. It reads, "This is the story of Hayek and Bel, and places the origin of the Armenian people as the descendants of the biblical Noah via his son Japheth. Hayek, a descendant of Japheth, a noted archer, hence his later association with Orion, rebelled one day against Bel the evil and repressive Babylonian tyrant, and returned back to his homeland around Mount Ararat in ancient Armenia. Bel followed Hayek in his relations, so that a mighty battle followed, in which Bel was killed. Hayek then gave his name to his descendants, the Hay people, and the name of the region of Armenia in the Armenian language, Hayesne." So, according to the Armenians, they descend from a man named Hayek, and Hayek is from the lineage of Japheth. So Armenians claim descent from Japheth. And this is from Insight on the Scriptures, Volume 2, and it reads, Togarmah. Many commentators connect Togarmah with the Armenians. The Armenians themselves traditionally claim to be the descendants from Hayek, son of Togarmah. So we see that Armenians say that they descend from Hayek, and then Hayek is the son of Togarmah, who was in the Caucasus. And that's one thing I want to make clear, that a lot of people seem to think that that there was only one type of people in the Caucasus, but no. You have non-Semitic people in the Caucasus. You have these people who claim descent from Togarmah. I want to make that clear, that Japheth really was the one who inhabited the Caucasus after all the events happened in Scripture. Japheth was the one to have settled that region. So Armenians seem to be a mixture of Hurrians and Indo-Europeans, both being descendants of Japheth. But furthermore, Armenians believe they descend from Hayek, the son of Togarmah. Now, ethnically speaking, who are Armenians related to? Now let's get into the genetics and ethnic relatedness to the Armenians. Who is related to Armenians? Again, this can help us know who is Shem and who is Japheth in the Middle East by knowing the Armenian genome. So what is it? We observe that Armenians form a distinctive cluster bound by Europeans, that makes sense, Near Easterners, and the Caucasus populations, that makes sense as well. More specifically, Armenians are close to Spaniards, Italians, and Romanians from Europe. So all those are European populations, non-Semitic, makes sense. Lebanese, Jews, Druze, and Cretans from the Near East. So that's interesting. And Georgians and Abkhazians from the Caucasus. That makes sense as well. This, by the way, is from Genetic Insight for an origin of the Armenians from Bronze Age mixing and multiple populations. So as they said, Armenians are basically related to Europeans, Near Easterners, and Caucasians. And it would seem that most of the populations that Armenians are related to are non-Semitic speakers, Europeans and Caucasians being that. Whereas a small branch of Middle Easterners or a small branch of Semitic speakers are related to Armenians as well. It says, we find in Armenians and other genetic isolates in the Near East high shared ancestry with ancient European farmers, with ancestry proportions being similar to present-day Europeans. So again, they're ancestry proportions are similar to present-day Europeans, no different than a modern-day European, but not to present-day Near Easterners. These results suggest that genetic isolates in the Near East, Cretans and island population, Near Eastern Jews and Christians, religious isolates, and Armenians, ethno-linguistic isolate, probably retain the features of the ancient genetic landscape in the Near East that had more affinity to Europe than the present-day populations do. So that's why Armenians are so important when it comes to us right now and just studies in general, that they represent an ancient genetic landscape in the Near East that had more affinity to Europe than the present-day populations do. And so basically we see that there is an ancient European non-Semitic component that resided in the ancient Near East, and this makes sense when you look into the ancient empires that existed in the Middle East. Not every Middle Eastern empire was Semitic. There was Indo-European empires in the Middle East, Mitanni, Hittites, Kassites, etc. So it makes sense to see this residue, this genetic residue, still existing within modern Middle Eastern populations. So continuing, it says, our studies show that most of the Near East genetic isolates ancestry that is shared with Europeans can be attributed to expansions after the Neolithic period. And those expansions are likely referring to the Yamnaya expansions, the Proto-Indo-European expansions. So Armenians' adoption of a distinctive culture early in their history resulted in their genetic isolation from the surroundings. Their genetic resemblance today to other genetic isolates in the Near East, but not to most other Near Easterners, suggests that recent admixture has changed the genetic landscape in most populations in the region. Armenians' genetic diversity reveals that the ancient Near East had more affinity to Neolithic Europe than it does now, and that Bronze Age demographic processes had a major impact on the genetics of populations in the region. So again, we see that the ancient Near East had higher genetic affinity with Neolithic Europe. It's very important. This is from HLA alleles and haplotypes in the Turkish populations, relatedness to Kurds, Armenians, and other Mediterraneans, and it reads, Turks, I'm just going to read what's in yellow by the way, Turks, Kurds, Armenians, Iranians, Jews, Lebanese, and other Eastern and Western Mediterranean groups seem to share a common ancestry, the older Mediterranean substream. So again, when we read those populations, Turks, Kurds, Armenians, Iranians, Jews, and Lebanese, all these people have a connection with a common ancestor. So skipping down, Anatolian Hittites and Hurrian groups older than 2000 BCE. These may have given rise to present-day Kurdish, Armenian, and Turkish populations. So it's believed that Anatolian Hittites, an Indo-European population, and Hurrians, a Caucasian population, could have gave rise to Kurds, Armenians, and Turkic peoples. And we just read about all the peoples who are related to each other, the Armenians, and with these other Iranians and Lebanese and Turkish groups and such. They all may basically descend from these ancient Indo-European and Caucasian groups that once resided in the Middle East. So that's what we're trying. That's what I'm trying to illustrate and show y'all when it comes to what was going on back then and what we see today in the genetics. In summary, it seems that Turks, Kurds, and Armenians are very close genetically, and all of them seem to have been living in the area for a millennium. So this is from Genetic HLA Study of Kurds in Iraq, Iran, and Tbilisi, Caucasus, Georgia, relatedness and medical implications, and it reads, plain genetic distance DA show that Iraq Kurds closest genetic distance are the following: Middle East populations, Iran Kurds, Palestinians, Fars Parsi, Georgia Kurds, and Ashkenazi Jews. Eastern Mediterranean populations, Armenians, Cretans, and Macedonians, and Mediterranean populations, Sardinians, Spaniards, Algerians, and Italians. Our conclusions were that their HLA profiles show that Kurds form part of a Mediterranean stock of people and also had Caucasus genetic traits, Slavic Georgians. Also, it is worth it is worth mentioning that Lak population, East Caucasus area, may be close to both Lor and Kurd populations, and Lak name could be considered composed of Lor and Kurd words. In the present paper, we have analyzed HLA genes in Kurds living in North Iraq. Comparison with other populations place them as a Middle Eastern population close to Kurds from Tbilisi, Georgia, Palestinians, Armenians, and Kurds from Iran. In both analyses, Kurds are also close to Caucasian, Slav, and Georgian populations. Conclusion is that Kurds are genetically close to surrounding Caucasian and Mediterranean populations, and that have remained settled down in Kurdistan since ancient times, supporting historical records is viewed in our previous work. I'm going to read that last part again. Conclusion is that Kurds are genetically close to surrounding Caucasian and Mediterranean populations. So Kurds are basically, seem to be a sub-branch of Caucasian and Mediterranean peoples. And that makes sense from what we know about the Kurds being likely descendants of Hurrians. We're going to read what's in yellow. Hurrians, whose language is close and not Indo-European, may be Kurds' ancient genetic background. So again, Kurds is another good example of who the Hurrians' descendants would be left behind in the Near East. And we know about who the Kurds are related to as well. We're going to read what's in yellow down below. In summary, all three Kurd populations studied in the present paper are genetically close together and to other Mediterranean and Caucasus populations according to HLA genes. So, Japheth. Armenians, again, a people who claim descent from Togarmah and Japheth, have connections to ancient Europeans, and when it comes to modern human populations, they're close to Spaniards, Italians, Romanians, Lebanese, Jews, Druze, Cretans, Georgians, Azerbaijanis, Turkish, Kurdish, and Iranians, etc. Most of these populations are either Indo-European, and some of these populations have ethnic ties to Hurrians and Hittites, historically ancient Caucasian and Indo-European civilizations in the Near East. All of this lines up. Much less is known about the northwest part of modern Iran during the second millennium BCE, but from about 1000 BC onward, it acquired a new importance. A southward migration of Indo-European peoples many centuries earlier, which had brought the Hittites to Anatolia and the Kassites to Babylon, was now followed by a new wave of peoples. This is from Britannia, Iranian Art and Architecture. But I'm going to read that last part one more time. The southward migration of Indo-European peoples many centuries earlier, which had brought the Hittites to Anatolia and the Kassites to Babylon. Again, just re-emphasizing, Indo-European populations came into the Middle East, Hittites and Kassites being examples. And it's interesting because, as we read earlier, all these modern-day Middle Eastern populations being related to each other and having connections to who? Hittites, and as well as Hurrian groups, Kassites likely possibly being a Hurrian tribe. This is from Mitanni of Britannia. Mitanni, Indo-Iranian Empire, centered in northern Mesopotamia that flourished from about 1500 to about 1360 BC. Mitanni was one of several kingdoms and small states, another being Hurri, founded by the Indo-Iranians in Mesopotamia and Syria. Although originally these Indo-Iranians were probably members of Aryan tribes that later settled in India, they apparently broke off from the main tribes on their way and migrated to Mesopotamia instead. There they settled among the Hurrian peoples and soon became the ruling nobility called Mari Anu. So again, the Mitanni, they're Indo-Iranian people. One branch of these Aryans went into India to conquer India. Another branch went into the Middle East. And they became a ruling nobility. And they founded empire in the Middle East. Again, you have Indo-European peoples in the Middle East. The Middle East is not just Semitic people. You had other people there. So here's the Mitanni Empire, centered in the middle of the Middle East. And it's situated a little bit north of the northern Mesopotamia. You have the Hittites to your northwest, should I say, in Anatolia. The Kassites, as I read, another possibly Indo-Iranian, but with a mixture of Hurrian peoples. And so all of these empires right here that you're reading and that you see are Indo-European and Hurrian. They're not Semitic. Kassite, Mitanni, Hittite, read any source, they're not Semitic. So now Armenians are also related to Middle Eastern populations, as we read. Genetically speaking, some modern West Asian groups are basically just a subset of Caucasians. This is why I consider Caucasian/Iranian ancestry, as well as haplogroup J, from what we have covered earlier, to be Japheth. These would be your descendants of Japheth within the Middle East. I would also consider the Armenian phenotype, often called Armanoid, to belong to Japheth as well, rather than Shem. And the reason I say this is because the Armanoid phenotype is mostly associated with ancient Hittites, who are Indo-Europeans, and Hurrians, who are Caucasians. So, the Armanoid phenotype is not really Semitic in origin. You see it with ancient Indo-Europeans and ancient Caucasians. Can't really associate that with Semites. So this look isn't Semitic in origin, but it is a phenotype you see among Middle Easterners. So I will make a caveat here. I do consider it to be a Middle Eastern phenotype, but it's just not Semitic in origin. But it is Middle Eastern. I'll just say it's Indo-European and Caucasian. And oddly enough, Middle Easterners are basically a subset of Caucasians, quite literally. This is from Human Ancestry Correlates with Language and Reveals that Race is Not an Objective Genomic Classifier. And it reads, West Asian ancestry correlates with Northwest Caucasian, Northeast Caucasian, Northwest Caucasian, and Kartvelian language families, as well as the Armenian branch of the Indo-European language. To expound this point, West Asian ancestry certainly exists at its highest frequency in peoples from the Caucasus Mountains and the Levant, and is the major ancestry in Abkhazian, Georgian, and Druze samples. 8. The correlation of West Asian ancestry with Northeast Caucasian, Northwest Caucasian, and Kartvelian languages is consistent with the phylogenetic hypothesis that these three groups of languages are related in the larger grouping called Ibero-Caucasian. So basically, West Asian ancestry is Caucasian ancestry. That's basically what it is. And this is also why, if you take a DNA test, like for instance, let's say you're an African American, if you take a DNA test, chances are you're not going to get West Asian related ancestry, because West Asian related ancestry is linked to Caucasian ancestry. So that's that reason. But parallel evolution of genes and languages in the Caucasus region, this is basically going to break down exactly that Middle Easterners are a subset of Caucasians. Combining genetic and linguistic findings, we now propose a model of the evolution of Caucasian populations. The final tree was obtained by merging the genetic clusters with the background linguistic tree. We conclude that the Caucasus gene pool originated from a subset of the Near East gene pool due to an Upper Paleolithic or Neolithic migration, followed by significant genetic drift, probably due to isolation in the extreme mountainous landscape. So just to read the relevant part, basically the Caucasian gene pool originated from a subset of the Near Eastern gene pool. There seems to be a they're basically, like, as they said, a subset. Near Easterners being a subset of Caucasians, or Caucasians being a subset of Near Easterners. And that's what we see when we look at the genetic distance. Middle Easterners, well, certain Middle Easterners, are in this middle section where it seems like they're either a subset of Caucasians or they're a subset of European populations. Now, that's basically what Near Easterners are. They're in between Caucasians and Europeans. This is often why I say Middle Easterners are really Irano-Caucasian. But again, they're a subset of Caucasians or a subset of Europeans. Both of which, ironically, Caucasians and Europeans are non-Semitic. They're non-Semitic speakers, they're non-Semitic people. Most people associate Caucasian populations with Japheth, and most people associate European populations with Japheth as well. So the fact that you have certain Middle Easterners with relations to Caucasians and Europeans would lead me to believe that just some people in the Middle East are descendants of Japheth. It's about as simple as that. Some Middle Easterners are just Japhetic people. So again, just going to read you when it comes to the Y DNA. Among haplogroup J2A4B *M67 comprised 51 through 79% of the Y chromosomes in the English and 3 Chechnyan populations, Northeast Caucasus Nak linguistic group. Finally, haplogroup J1 *M267 comprised 44 through 99% of Southeast Caucasus Dagestan linguistic group. And so you see the genetic tree and the linguistic tree. They both overlap each other beautifully. Here you see that the North Caucasian linguistic kind of branched into these groups in the genetic tree. So putting everything together. Another Togarma, this one being the son of both Tyrus and Gomer, is mentioned by Armenian Moses of Caron and Georgian Letoni Mavroni, who regarded Togarma as the founder of their nation along with other Caucasian peoples. According to Moses of Caron's History of Armenia and to Letoni Mavroni's medieval Georgian chronicles, Togarmos was thought to have lived in Babylon before he received the land between the 2 seas and 2 mountains, i.e. the Caucasus, in his possession. He then settled near Mount Ararat and divided his land among his sons. Hayek, the first son of Togarmos, inherited Mount Ararat and founded the Armenian nation. Kartulos settled in northeast from Ararat, founder of Kartli, who united other brothers and founded the Georgian nation. Herodos settled in the eastern part of Ararat, and Caucasus settled beyond the Caucasus range. So basically, it would seem that Togarma was the one of the descendants of Noah, specifically from the lineage of Japheth, that settled the Caucasus. And Togarma settled around Mount Ararat, settled around the South Caucasus region, and all those parts of the world, north of the Near East. This was the territory of Togarma, all these Caucasian populations. And anyone who descends from these Caucasian populations or is related to these Caucasian populations would be descendants of Togarma as well. So, J1 seen highest among these Caucasian populations that claim descent from Togarma, as you can see, up to 98.5%. Here are the populations like the Dargins and the Avars and such, the Chechnyans, the Luzguians. And then J2 seen up to 87% in English and Georgians and Chechnyans and all these other Caucasian populations. So the Armatoid Phenotype, just going over it really quick. Short-headed and high-skulled type with fleshy features, a flat occiput and hooked nose, often black-haired and with light brown skin, common in mountain regions of Asia Minor, especially Armenia and Anatolia. Found in ancient Sumerians, Babylonians like the Kassites, Hittites, and Cretans around 4000 BCE. This is likely the typical phenotype of what Togarmah's descendants looked like, this Armenoid phenotype. I consider it to be Togarmah phenotype from Japheth. The so-called Armenoid type is defined by Hayden under the Eurasiatic brachycephalus as Anatolian Armenian, dark hair, tawny white skin, medium stature, very brachycephalic, a prominent aquiline meaning hooked nose with a depressed tip and large wings is very characteristic, scattered in Anatolia, Armenia. The ancient Hittites were typical members of this race. This is from Contributions to the Anthropology of Iran. So here is how the descendants of Togarmah likely looked like in the past with the Hittites and look like currently with Kurds and Armenians and other Middle Eastern populations that would kind of have this phenotype. I would consider this to be from Togarmah, and that this is also likely the typical phenotype of the Hurrians. This is also a Hurrian phenotype, I would say, since the Hurrians were kind of scattered with the Hittites and the Mitanni and the Kassites and all these other groups, because Kurds and Armenians both claim descent from the Hurrians. So it'll make sense that they will still carry the phenotype of their ancestors. And the Armenid type, widespread, found in the most specialized form in the mountains of Asia Minor, associated with ancient Cretans and the Hittite kingdom, as we just read. Common in Armenians, makes sense. Turks of mountain ranges, Tartarus. Lebanese, significant in Georgians. Azerbaijanis, Kurds, West Persians, Jews across the Mediterranean. Crete, South Italy and Southwest Spain, Crete, Tunisia, and Central Asia, Syria, traces far south to Yemen and India. Physical traits: light brown skin with wavy dark brown hair, hyperbrachycephalic. And so this is what most people typically say is a Middle Eastern phenotype. I completely agree. I just disagree with the statement that this is a Semitic phenotype. It is not. It is a Indo-European Caucasian phenotype, which is not Semitic. So I believe Togarmah, the grandson of Japheth, represents Caucasian languages, Irano-Caucasian ancestry, haplogroup J, and the Armenoid phenotype. But now we must ask ourselves, why does this type dominate the Middle East? I believe Scripture actually prophesied these events. Why is Japheth descendants in the land of Shem? Genesis chapter 9 verse 27 is the best explanation I can find. The first part of the verse says that Japheth shall enlargeth. So it says Japheth may enlargeth. This is from Strong's 6601. And it is Japheth or Japheth. May enlargeth or shall enlargeth, as you can see right here. Pronounce patha, patha, to be spacious, wide, or open. And this is again from Strong 6601. From Genesis chapter 9 verse 27. It says, may God enlargeth, Hebrew word patha, to be spacious or wide or open. I believe this could be referring to the Great Migration, the core or axis migration, and the Indo-European migrations into the Middle East, since it's typically believed that Japheth is the father of Indo-Europeans and Caucasians. The blessing pronounced unto Japheth by his father carried with it the idea that his descendants will be greatly multiplied, enlarged in the future. The table of nations recorded in Genesis chapter 10 indicates that Japheth became the father of a ranging family of peoples whose homes lay to the north and mostly west of Palestine. In fact, 14 nations of Japhethites are listed in Genesis 10. The area of their occupation ranged all the way from the smelting plants of Tarshish Spain, and the west of the Caspian Sea in the east. This included this included what is now the steppes of southern Russia, much of Asia Minor, and the islands of the Mediterranean and the coast of southern Europe. Japheth is said to be the father of Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Titus. Genesis chapter 10, verse 2, 1, and Chronicles chapter 1, verse 4. These are the progenitors of the Indo-European Caucasian family of nations. Again, these are the progenitors of the Indo-European Caucasian family of nations. So Japheth is associated with Indo-Europeans and Caucasian peoples. And so here is the territory of Japheth, so you can see it in a map. He basically took over all the northern part of the Near East. I often hear that people say Shem inhabited the Caucasus and that all of the Middle East is the land of Shem. I don't know where or why people say this, but from what I see, most Genesis 10 Bible maps, Table of Nation maps, Japheth was the one who settled northern part of the Near East. And it makes sense even from a historical standpoint, genetic standpoint, linguistic standpoint. Most peoples north of the Near East are not Semitic. A lot of them are Indo-European speakers, and a lot of them have different traditions of descending from Japheth. But also, we see that most of this area, it just fits from the biblical narrative as well. As you can see, modern times, when it comes to the language families of the Middle East, all of this all of this orange is Indo-European languages. So it kind of fits, as I was saying. Most people in the Caucasus and north of Syria and Iraq are Indo-European. Like all of Iran, Turkey, Armenia, Georgia. Well, in blue is actually Caucasian languages, but that just solidifies the point. And also in green is the Altic, but originally this Altic language before the Turks came, it would have been orange, because you would have had Indo-European peoples like the Greeks, who are the Turkish peoples, and then you would have had, even before the Greeks, the Hittites, who are Indo-European people. So that kind of puts everything together. But again, as I was saying, when it comes to Japheth enlarging and becoming widened or opened, I believe this fits with the core or axis migration. So this paper actually deals with the core or axis migration. It reads, on the other hand, Kohol hypothesizes the possibility of a push-pull process in which new groups of people with wheeled chariots and ox-pulled wagons gradually moved from the steppes of the north into the southern Caucasus, and the core or axis communities subsequently moved further south. So the core or axis communities, these Caucasian communities, moved further south. Kohol also reminds us of the evidence of increased militarism from the early to late Bronze Age that is reflected in more fortified sites, new weaponry, and a iconography of war as seen in the Kershub Cup. Kohol argues that while the number of core axis settlements decreased in the South Caucasus, archaeological research indicates that the core axis culture spread to western Iran, in the Zagros region, and to the Levant. In Kohol's view, new groups of people moved in. The core axis communities abandoned the southern Caucasus and moved further south, where some of them already resided. Others associated the cultures of the post-core axis period, especially in Tsereteli culture, with movement of people from the Near East, possibly the expansion of Hurrian tribes. And we talked about how Hurrians are descendants of the core or axis people. So we see these core or axis Caucasian groups moving and migrating south, going into western Iran and going past Mesopotamia into the Levant and such. And the Hurrians seem to be the ones doing the expansion. And again, just going to read the relevant portion dealing with the Hurrians and the Coraxes. The northeast Caucasian language family seems to show clear links to ancient Eastern Anatolia, as most subclades of J1-Z1842 can be linked to the Armenian highlands and present-day Azerbaijan, precisely fitting the exact location of the Coraxes culture, 3400 BCE through 2000 BCE. Three subclades of it, J1-ZS3042, TMRCA is 3500 BCE, J1-ZS5658 TMRCA is 2800 BCE, J1-ZS2872 2800 BCE, and J1-Y5353 TMRCA is 2500 BCE, are widespread among Northeast Caucasian groups. Suggest Northeast Caucasian languages to have originated from the Coraxes culture, as ancient J1 subclades also seem to have been present in the Levant as well. This supports the existence of the Alduin language family, linking Hurrian to Northeast Caucasian. So again, it begins in the South Caucasus, and then they begin to migrate further south, and then migrate as far south as the Levant with the Kerbek-Kerik wire culture. A Caucasian, non-Semitic by the way, culture. All begins in the Caucasus, migrate further south. And again, this fits with Japheth. This name in Genesis chapter 9 verse 27 seems to be explained by the phrase, "May God make wide Japheth," the American Standard Revised Version, Enlargeth. The association with Japheth, the association of Japheth with Shem, dark, because Shem is likely dark skinned. Ham, black, suggests a name on similar lines, either genitalic or descriptive of race. Japheth has therefore been explained as meaning fair, light skin, from Japheth. The non-Semitic and non-Hamitic races known to the Jews being all more or less white skin. So Japheth, being associated with white skin and such, non-Semitic, non-Hamitic people. The intermediate descendants of Japheth were 7 in number and are represented by the nations designated Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Titus, or roughly the Armenians, which we covered, Lydians, Medes, Greeks, Tarbians, and Mushkians, and last Titus, remaining still obscure. The sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah were all settled in Western Asia. And I want to make that clear. It is believed that Gomer's descendants, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah, but perhaps more specifically Togarmah, settled in West Asia, that's the Middle East. While the sons of Javan, Elash, Tyrus, Kittim, Dodium, and Rhodium, or Redendium, occupied the Mediterranean coast and the adjacent islands. So those people settled the Mediterranean, Southern Europe. And this is from International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. And this fits with what we see when it comes to the migration of these Indo-European peoples. This is from the peoples of the highlands, vanished cultures of Larston, Manani, and Urartu. During the second millennium, the long process began by which Indo-European peoples from the northern steppes beyond the Caucasus established themselves about Western Asia, Iran, and northern India. Their earliest pressure perhaps drove some of the native peoples of the mountains to migrate or infiltrate, and sometimes come as invaders into Mesopotamia and northern Syria, even in the third millennium. The Indo-Europeans then drove their way through these peoples, drawing many of them in their train as subjects or allies, and appeared themselves early in the second millennium as invaders and conquerors in the Near East. So you have these Indo-Europeans and Caucasian groups coming in as invaders of the Near East. For the first half of the millennium, the Highlanders under Indo-European leadership dominated the older peoples of the plains, most of whom were Semites. And so as we can see, these Indo-Europeans and Caucasian groups, they dominated the older populations, which were Semitic. The Semitic populations are the older ones in the Middle East, and they lived in the plains. They lived in the warmer parts, which is what the Book of Jubilees said, that Shem was in the warm areas. So, two other peoples are directly relevant, namely the Kassites from whom the Zagros Mountains in the region of Larstan, and the Hurrians who spread from regions further north, particularly from Armenia. Both were themselves native peoples of the highland and spoke languages which were not Indo-European but belonging to a group sometimes loosely called Caucasian, once widespread but later surviving only in the Caucasus. They were led by Indo-European aristocracies, smaller in number but great in energy and achievement. They were the first to use the horse in war, to draw the light chariot with spoked wheels. Indo-European names of gods at least appear among the Kassites, and of gods and rulers much more obviously among the Hurrians, in whom this element was clearly stronger. In both cases, the names reveal the Indic branch of the Indo-European family, of which the main body moved through Iran to conquer northern India. And so this fits with Haplogroup J's migration as well. This is from How Eurasia Was Born. While early Indo-Europeans who originally crossed from Anatolia in the Bronze Age were most likely represented by various J2 subclades, genetic data suggests that as soon as they reached Central Europe, they assimilated large masses of the native population, and from then on, the rest of their expansion were characterized by more frequently formed subclades of haplogroups characteristic to the native populations. So here is the Indo-European migrations, groups as I just read, groups coming from the North Caucasus into the South Caucasus, becoming the Mitanni, groups coming from the Balkans into Anatolia, becoming the Hittites, groups coming from Iran, also another branch of people who could have became the Mitanni, or even the Kassites, because we see these groups also penetrating into Mesopotamia where the Akkadians were, and we know about the Gutians who collapsed Akkad. The Mitanni would have clashed, all these Indo-European peoples would have clashed with the Semites, because the Semites are coming from the Middle East. They're coming from, specifically either the Levant or Arabia. And so basically there was a clash between Japheth and Shem in this area of Mesopotamia. It seems like, in a sense, you could say that there was a border, which is what many of the Bible maps do show, that most of these Indo-Europeans are north and these Semites are south. Basically, Indo-Europeans are north of the Mesopotamia rivers, and the Semites are south of the Mesopotamian rivers, with the exception of the Assyrians sort of being swallowed up by a lot of these Caucasian and Indo-European groups that kind of got surrounded. But most of these Semitic peoples were south of the Euphrates and Tigris River. So here's another map displaying it. As I said, most Indo-Europeans are north of the Tigris, Euphrates River, specifically the Tigris. You have the Anatolian Hittites, you have the Aryans, and you have Caucasians right here. And this just displays that there was, in fact, the Indo-European migration into the Middle East. Not everybody's a Semite in the Middle East. You got Indo-European descendants there. And here's just one more map tracing the origins of Indo-European languages. You see Armenian right here, Anatolian, then Indo-Iranian stretching again above what would be the Tigris and Euphrates River. All this part is the land of Japheth. All of this is Indo-European. And this fits with what we know about the infiltration of northern groups. This is from Report on the Human Remains found at Kish. But it is possible that even in this period, the Armenoids of the north were beginning to infiltrate into northern Sumer. And it must be remembered that as soon as the fall of the Semitic empire of Akkad, the entire land of Sumer and Akkad was ruled for over a century by the Gutians from the north, beyond the upper and lower Zeb rivers. The valuable results obtained by the authors of this paper confirm that the historians had assumed in regard to the early mixture of Sumerians and Semites at Kish, the oldest capital of Sumer and the greatest metropolis of the north, later known as Akkad. Dr. Buxton finds an increasing admixture of the round-headed Armenoid type. This must be explained as an infiltration from Syria and the Hittite region if they are not normal variants. Again, northern Armenoid peoples coming into the Semitic Akkadian Empire. And this is from The Ancient Egyptians and the Origins of Civilization by G. Elliott Smith. There is a considerable mass of evidence to show that there was a very close resemblance between the Proto-Egyptians and the Arabs before either became intermingled with the Armenoid racial element. Again, an Armenoid people came into Egypt, came into Arabia, and they mixed with Egyptians and Arabians and kind of changed the phenotype. This is from the book The Arabs, and it reads, "The original inhabitants of Arabia then, according to Sir Arthur Keith, one of the world's greatest living anthropologists who has made a study of Arab skeletal remains, ancient and modern, were not the familiar Arabs of our own time, but a very much darker people. A proto-Negroid belt of mankind stretched across the ancient world from Africa to Malaysia, giving rise to the Hamitic peoples of Africa, to the Dravidian peoples of India, and to the intermediate dark people inhabiting the Arabian Peninsula. In the course of time, two big migrations of fair-skinned peoples came from the north." It's always the north. "One of them, the Mongoloids, to break through and transform the dark belt of mankind beyond India. The other, the Caucasoids, to drive a wedge between India and Africa. The more vile invaders overcame the dark-skinned peoples, absorbing most of them, driving others southwards, where my own explorations is believed to have discovered vestiges of them in their natural sanctuary beyond the great sea ocean of Rub al-Khali." So again, you have a migration of Caucasoid peoples, as he said, two migrations, but I believe that there was many, and these people absorbed with the darker skinned people, or a lot of the darker skinned people went south. So those are two things that they would have happened. So returning back to Genesis chapter 9, verse 27, "Japheth enlarged, and he dwelt in the tents of Shem." The tents of Shem likely refers to the land or the home of Shem. It's where Shem settled. With Japheth being the father of Indo-Europeans and Caucasians, this perfectly matches with the core Araxis and Indo-European expansions into the Middle East. I believe this is a perfect match. Genesis chapter 9, verse 27, referring to this migration of Indo-Europeans and core Araxis people. But there is a deeper meaning to this verse as well. Genesis chapter 9, verse 27 can also be saying that Japheth will be deceived. So if you look at Strong 6601, the same one that deals with Enlargeth, we see that it can mean to be spacious, open, be wide, but there's a second meaning: to be simple, entice, deceive, persuaded, to be open-minded, to be naive. So you see this, here it is right here in yellow. All these other meanings that could go into this verse. So this is very interesting to me. So could we kind of combine this understanding of Enlargeth and also being deceived. According to Genesis chapter 9, verse 27, Japheth would be enticed, deceived, and persuaded. But what does this mean? Could it mean that Japheth would be enticed or persuaded into the tents of Shem? Perhaps he was enticed or persuaded because of the rich land. Back then, as we read from various sources, it would seem that most of these Caucasian and Indo-European groups were coming into Mesopotamia because it was fertile. It was the Fertile Crescent, and they were coming because they needed or wanted better, richer lands. We see that most of these peoples, like the Gutians and Hurrians, were in the very cold parts of the north, mountainous regions. They say the Zagros Mountains. It's a very rough terrain, and so it makes sense that these descendants of Japheth, living in these mountainous regions, these highlands, came into the plains, but there was already people there, being Shem, being Semitic peoples. So what did they do? They came in, they migrated. This is Genesis chapter 9, verse 27. And they were persuaded into the tents of Shem for a better life, basically, for better land and opportunity. This being, so just going back again, could it be that Japheth would be enticed or persuaded into the tents of Shem? This meaning into the lands, culture, and language of Shem as well. After all, Hurrians, who are likely the descendants of Japheth through Togarmah, did assimilate into Semitic culture. Also, ironically, it's those with haplogroup J that adopted the Semitic language from haplogroup E, which we established haplogroup J equals Togarmah and haplogroup E equals Shem. So this verse also could be referring to Japheth adopting the culture of Shem. With a few centuries of the fall of Wash-Uk-Ani to Assyria, Mitanni became fully Assyrianized and linguistically Aramaicized, and use of the Hurrian language began to be discouraged throughout the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So in history, the Assyrians conquered the Mitanni, which was ethnically mostly Hurrian with Iranian peoples as well. And these Hurrians would have basically been forced to adopt the Assyrian culture and the Aramaic language. So you could have Semitic speaking people in the Middle East with Hurrian ancestry because their ancestors adopted it. They were forced to adopt it because they were conquered by the Assyrians. And that's a very important thing to note. Again, many Middle Easterners could basically be descendants of Hurrians, ancient peoples who adopted into various Semitic cultures. This is from haplogroup J1, Edupedia. This is going to do exactly what I said about adoption. It says, looking at the map of J1-P58, it is easy to assume that JP58 is a marker of Arabic ancestry because it reaches its maximum frequency in and around the Arabian Peninsula. But that would be an oversimplification. It is important to make a clear distinction between people who speak Arabic and those who are genetically Arabic. These are two completely different things. For comparison, people who speak languages descended from Latin, such as French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, are not necessarily descendants from the ancient Romans of the Latinium or Latium. Even those who do may not have more than a tiny fraction of their genome which was inherited from actual Roman ancestors. This is why most Romance language speakers today cannot be considered as genetically Roman. Most present-day Arabic speakers outside the Arabian Peninsula are likewise only very partially or not all Arabic genetically. In the northern half of the Middle East, most of the people who call themselves Arabs of today are in fact mainly descendants of other historic peoples, such as the Phoenicians, Assyrians, Babylonians, or even the Hurrians, which we just read about extensively. Most of these peoples are predominantly J2, with many minor haplogroups like E1B1B, G, J1, L, Q, R1A, R1B, and T. So this is from World History Encyclopedia dealing with the Hurrians, and it reads, "It was likely that the Hurrian conquest of that region was a complex phenomenon, including peaceful migration and infiltration by mercenary bands in the pay of local city-states, followed by the rise to power of mercenary warlords, culminating in the eventual full-scale migration of Hurrian herding tribes out of the mountains into the more fertile river valleys." Again, these migrations seem to have been triggered by the need for more fertile land so that they could survive in a better environment than those harsh mountains. Continuing, it says, further, the Hurrians often seem to have adopted the culture of the city-states they conquered, which would have been mostly Semitic, making them less visible than ever in historical record. For example, we have no evidence of a distinctive Hurrian military system. It seems that if ever there were a people who were both everywhere and nowhere, it was the Hurrians. And that is very true. And this is from Eupedia J1. The other subclades of J1 cannot be considered to be the paternal descendants of the first speakers of Arabic. I'm going to read that again. The other subclades of J1 cannot be considered to be the paternal descendants of first speakers of Arabic. These other J1 lineages were Arabicized alongside other haplogroups like J2 and Q1b. So J1 is not really Arabic in origin, it was Arabicized. Like J1-P58, E-M34 is also shared with their cousins, their Semitic cousins, the Jews. Haplogroup E1B1B is considered the primary candidate for the origin and dispersal of Afro-Asiatic languages across northern and eastern Africa and Southwest Asia. The Semitic languages appear to have originated within a subclade of the M34 branch of E1B1B. So haplogroup E associated with Afro-Asiatic and Semitic. This is from the Cambridge of Ancient History. The Hurrians, it is true, showed a marked capacity for assimilating the cultural values of the more advanced peoples with whom they came into contact. So again, just reiterating, the Hurrians, these likely people who descend from Togarma, or descendant of Japheth, these were people who adopted others' cultures. It's just widely known. And the cultures that Hurrians would have been around in the Middle East would have been Semitic cultures. And this fits with the DNA of people adopting Semitic culture. Haplogroup J adopting Semitic culture from haplogroup E. This is from Genetics, Egypt, and History, interpreting geographical patterns of Y chromosome variation, and it reads, it can be postulated that select M35 carriers, speakers from Africa of a stage of ancestral Semitic, pre-Proto-Semitic, entered the Near East. Here's the kicker. Where indigenous peoples adopted it and via ongoing language shift and population growth eventually became innumerably greater than the original speakers of the ancestor. So these other peoples adopted Semitic and they had a baby boom and basically they became more numerous than the original people who formed the Semitic language. This would be E. E formed Semitic, and then J adopted it, and they began to just multiply and sort of take over geographically. So literally, we could have modern Semitic speakers in the Middle East that could be the descendants of ethnic Hurrians. I would say those with haplogroup J fit that mark. I would say people with haplogroup J are not Semitic in origin, but Japheth in origin. This is where the deception part of Genesis chapter 9 verse 27 comes into play. Could Genesis chapter 9 verse 27 be interpreted like this? So here's how the interpretation could be. Japheth would enlarge, migrate / invade, referring to Irano-Caucasian expansion. And 2, the tense being land, culture, language of Shem, referring to assimilation and adoption. But in this assimilation and adoption into language and culture of Shem, Japheth would be deceived and eventually believe that he is Shem. So that's one way how I kind of view this verse, how I interpret it. Basically, Japheth will enlarge, he would migrate, he would dwell in the tents of Shem, being the land, culture, and language of Shem. And then through this adoption and assimilation, he will eventually believe that he is Shem. He will kind of deceive himself, or he will kind of be deceived throughout time into believing that he is Shem. Again, this is just a possible interpretation of Genesis chapter 9, verse 27. Don't think that I'm saying that this is what the scripture is saying. I'm saying this is just an possible interpretation. A verse I do believe is connected to history. I can just see it personally for myself. I do see this verse as being connected to history and historical events that happened in the early, middle, and late Bronze Age, ending in the Iron Age. I kind of apply more of a historical context to it. But this is where we end. Japheth shall enlargeth and dwell in the tents of Shem. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe, share the video, click the bell, and leave a comment for any questions you might have. And follow my social media platforms that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. And with all of that out of the way, have a great day and shalom.